Hello, welcome back to lesson 6. Now, so far we've learned how to get user input, perform calculations, and display results. Now we're going to take everything we know and apply it to a real world problem. So if we were software engineers at a company, we wouldn't just jump in and start coding. Instead, we'd be given a project with requirements, and it would be our job to figure out how to turn those requirements into a working program. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to walk through how to think like a programmer and approach this challenge step by step. So our project today is to build a profit calculator program. Now, it's going to help us calculate total revenue, expenses, and profit for a business. But before we start coding, we need to ask ourselves some important questions. So we're going to go through the exact steps an engineer would take to break the problem down before writing any code. So by the end of this lesson, you'll know how to read, understand project requirements, break down a problem into clear steps, identify what inputs are needed and what outputs are needed to solve the problem, and organize a solution before you start writing code. So the most important thing to remember is programming is problem solving. If we were software engineers at a company, we wouldn't just start coding immediately. And instead, we would receive project requirements from a product manager. And the product manager is the person responsible for defining what the product needs to do and how it should function. And they usually sit in between the stakeholders and the engineering team, and they communicate back and forth between the two. This is a very loose definition of it, but as engineers, we work very closely with product managers and we rely on them to define how the product should work, how it should function. All right, so let's take a look at this project requirement. So your company wants to track profits from product sales. Your task is to create a profit calculator that takes in key business numbers and calculates total profit. The requirements. The program must calculate total revenue, total expenses, and total profit based on the information provided by the user. It must also calculate profit per product to see how much money is made per item. What needs to be calculated? Total revenue, total expenses, total profit, profit per product. And the expected output format. The output should look something like this. Testing your code. Try these numbers first. Okay, so, all right. We just got a lot of information right here in this README. So now the question is, how do we go about solving this? Now that we've read through the project requirements for the profit calculator, we understand the big picture. And so this program is going to help businesses calculate how much money they're making by determining revenue, expenses, and profit. But now comes this important question. How do we actually go about solving this? And so, like I said earlier, in software engineering, we don't just start coding right away. Instead, we break the problem down into smaller steps so that we fully understand what needs to be done before we write a single line of code. So let's go about organizing our thoughts and figuring this out. So I'm going to create a notes.md file, and so we'll be able to write everything down as we analyze the problem. So I'm going to go ahead in the File Explorer, select New File, and I'm going to type notes.md. You might be wondering what is a .md file, and this stands for Markdown, which is a simple way to format text. So think of it like a plain text file, but with the ability to add headings, bullet points, and even code snippets in a clean and organized way. So I'm using Markdown here because it's an easy way to take structured notes, but you can use a regular text file or just write notes down on paper if that works better for you. All right, so notes.md file. Okay, so I'm going to select this notes.md file and I'm going to right click and select split write. And so what that does is it allows us to see multiple files in one view. And if you notice, this says editor, this says editor and preview, and this says preview. So right now this is also a .md file, our README. And so for the notes.md, I'm going to put it on editor, which allows us to actually type. But if it's not on editor and it's on preview, it allows us to preview it in a nice, pretty way. So I'm going to actually make this a little bit smaller, make this a little bit smaller as well, so we can see more of our notes. It's profit calculator, breaking down the requirements. So step one, what we want to do is understand the problem. Before we can solve the problem, we need to clearly define what the program is supposed to do. And as we see in these project requirements, the goal of the profit calculator is pretty clear. This program must calculate total revenue, total expenses, and total profit based on the information provided by the user. It must also calculate profit per product to see how much money is made per item. So we see that the program is supposed to calculate total revenue, total expenses, total profit, and profit per product. Now, also, it gives us some formulas. These formulas are provided in the requirements. So let's just go ahead and annotate that as well, that is what's required. Okay, next, the expected output format. The output should look something like this. So we need to display the results in a clear format. All right, so how do we know all of this? Well, the requirements, it was right here, super explicit in this example. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to figure out, hey, all right, we need these calculations, we need to output this. How do we get this information? We need to identify where these numbers come from. So step 2, what information do we need? What are the inputs that need to be provided to us to be able to solve this problem? So I'm going to go ahead and put that down. What inputs does the user need to provide? And so we can see once again from our product requirements, it says that we need to calculate revenue expenses, and both of these depend on knowing how many products were sold and the price of each product and the cost of each product. So let's go ahead and annotate that. Okay, so now a next question is, well, what outputs does the program need to return? And so we can get that information. It kind of tells us in the requirements, but it really tells us what the expected output format is, that we're going to need total revenue, expenses, profits, and profits per item. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this down. What outputs does the program need to return? Total revenue, expenses, profit per product. Okay, so now step 3. How do we calculate these outputs? We know what information we need, and we now need to determine, yes, how do we actually calculate these results? Well, fortunately for us, the requirements tell us exactly what we need. Total revenue, boom, 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 what needs to be calculated? So let me just go ahead and mark this down. So how do we know these formulas are correct? Well, they are provided directly in the project requirements, but if they weren't given, we would then have to figure them out by thinking logically. And so Google, whatever, ChatGPT, like, how do you determine that information? That's how you would figure it out. So step 4, how are we going to format and display these results? And so once we have our calculations, we need to think about how we will present the results to the user. And so the project requirements don't just tell us what calculations to perform, it also provides an example of how the output should be formatted. And so formatting really does matter because a program isn't just about getting the right answer, it's also about making the answer clear and easy to either read or consume for the user. So when we're looking at our project requirements, boom, it says expected output format, and the output should look something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and type that into our notes. So this tells us that we need to format our results so that they appear in a structured format, not just plain numbers. But what is interesting, this example actually does not explicitly show decimal places. So do we need to only show whole numbers, or do we need to show decimal places? Well, let's think about this critically. When we're dealing with money and in real world business calculations, prices, costs, etc., we most likely want to say $5.75 rather than just $5. Even though the example doesn't explicitly show decimal places, we know from real world contexts that businesses usually deal with money using 2 decimal places. So this is super important takeaway. Sometimes project requirements won't tell you every little detail. As a programmer, you need to think logically and ask yourself, what makes the most sense for this type of data? So let's go ahead and type some formatting notes in here that we can refer to when we start implementing. All right. So use money signs just to make sure, round numbers to decimal places, ensure spacing and alignment matches the expected format. Last but not least, how should we structure our code? We have a lot of information here. We've dissected this, but it could be really good and helpful for you to actually really think about how to structure your code beforehand. And so it just makes things a lot easier when you start implementing, when you take these steps beforehand and kind of plan out your approach. So in this, let's think about it. So we should ask the user for input initially. That's the first thing that we need to do. And then next, we're going to have to do some type of calculations using the formulas. And then last but not least, display the results in a formatted way. There might be some additional steps in between to get everything to work correctly, but this isn't about writing every single last detail unless you need it. But in this instance, I think this is a really good start. And then as you go, you might see like, hey, I might need something else to make this do XYZ. All right, so final thought. This is it. We broke down the requirements like this, and we created a clear roadmap for what our program needs to do. Now, if we had jumped straight into coding, we might have missed something, made errors, or written messy code. But because we analyzed the problem first, we now have everything we need to start building the profit calculator step by step. And this is exactly how real software engineers approach coding problems. This is thinking like a programmer. Before they write any code, they take the time to understand the requirements, they identify inputs and outputs, define the calculations or logic, business logic, and they structure their approach. So now that we have a solid plan, in the next lesson, we're going to implement the profit calculator step by step and bring this program to life.